Coming up on Network Africa, judges at the International Criminal Court find former rebel leader Bosco Ntaganda guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Prime Minister of Mali pledges to boost security in the country's central region following several ethnic clashes. Plus, the Supreme Court in Algeria orders the detention of a former head of the FLN political party. Hello and a warm welcome to the program. I'm Teniola Shobale. We begin the program today with stories and happenings that made headlines over the weekend. On Saturday, the deputy chair of the Sudanese Transitional Military Council and high-profile military leader General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo welcomed the deal reached between Sudanese parties. Sudan's ruling military council, headed by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and a coalition of opposition and protest groups agreed provisionally to share power for 3 years on Friday. Dagalo, commonly known as Hemedti, serves as deputy chairman of the Transitional Military Council, which has been running Sudan since President Omar Hassan al-Bashir's fall in April. At a large military parade in the East Nile area outside Khartoum, supporters gathered to hear Dagalo speak, who criticized the former Sudanese dictatorship for neglecting religious leaders. The deal, due to be finalized on Monday, revives hope for a peaceful transition of power in a country plagued by internal conflicts and years of economic crisis that helped to trigger the overthrow of al-Bashir. A group of 58 migrants arrived in Valletta on Sunday after they were rescued by the Maltese armed forces off the coast of Libya. The men, all coming from sub-Saharan African countries, were rescued from a boat north of Malta by a patrol boat early on Sunday after having called NGO Alarm Phone, a rescue support service for refugees in distress at sea. In another development, rescue ship Alan Kurdi with 65 migrants on board were not given clearance to enter Maltese waters after Italy refused entry. Italy's migration policy has led to clashes between NGOs and Italian authorities over rules that effectively close off the country's ports to their boats. The Alan Kurdi, operated by German NGO CI, is the latest of several vessels carrying migrants that has faced problems trying to dock in the past couple of weeks. The vessel, named after the 3-year-old Syrian refugee Alan Kurdi, who drowned in the Mediterranean in 2015, decided on Saturday to change course for Malta after a standoff with Rome. Eventually, Malta allowed the group into its territory after Prime Minister Joseph Muscat had talks with the European Commission and Germany, much to the disappointment of Italian Interior Minister Matteo Salvini. In Rome, Pope Francis expressed his sorrow for the migrants killed by airstrikes against a detention center in Libya that killed at least 53 people, including children. Speaking to thousands of people gathered in St. Peter's Square for his Sunday address, the pontiff expressed his sorrow and asked the faithfuls to join him in a silent prayer for the people killed in the airstrike that hit a detention center for mostly African migrants in Tripoli on Tuesday. The leader of the world's 1.2 billion Catholics also remembered the victims of recent violence in Afghanistan, Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger, and hopes human corridors for migrants will be organized in an extended way. The migrant center attack marks the highest publicly reported toll from an airstrike or shelling since Eastern forces under Khalifa Haftar launched a ground and aerial offensive 3 months ago to take the capital Tripoli, which is the base of Libya's internationally recognized government.
To our main stories now, former rebel leader Bosco Ntaganda has been found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Democratic Republic of Congo by judges at the International Criminal Court. Ntanga, popularly known as Terminator, was convicted of 18 counts, including murder, rape, and using child soldiers. His lawyers had argued that he was a victim, having also been recruited as a child soldier. He becomes the fourth person convicted by the ICC since its creation in 2002.
For the reasons I have just summarized, the Chamber, having heard all of the evidence presented by the parties, finds you, as concerns count 1, guilty of murder as crime against humanity, as concerns count 2, guilty of murder as a war crime, as concerns count 3, guilty of intentionally directing attacks against civilians as a war crime, as concerns count 4, guilty of rape as a crime against humanity, as concerns count 5 and 6, guilty of rape as a war crime, as concerns count 7, guilty of sexual slavery as a crime against humanity, as concerns counts 8 and 9, guilty of sexual slavery as a war crime, as concerns count 10, guilty of persecution as a crime against humanity, as concerns count 11, guilty of pillage as a war crime, as concerns count 12, guilty of forcible transfer of population as a crime against humanity, as concerns count 13, guilty of ordering the displacement of the civilian population as a war crime. As a result of the Chamber's judgment, you shall remain in detention until such time as the Chamber determined your sentence.
We have with us now a former ICC prosecutor, Mr. Charles Adeogun Phillips, to discuss more on this. Mr. Adeogun Phillips, firstly, thank you for joining us on Network Africa. But what would you say the significance of this judgment given to Bosco Ntaganda at the ICC is?
Every conviction at the ICC is a success for international justice and the fight against impunity. That said, Ntaganda is one of 5 Congolese rebel leaders brought before the ICC, and yet another example of the ICC gaining successes in the trials of low-level perpetrators. You will recall that Ntaganda's own commander, Thomas Lubanga, was himself convicted by the ICC in 2012, following which he was sentenced to 14 years. One must underscore the point, of course, that the ICC itself was established to prosecute those who bear the greatest responsibility for violations of international law, and not necessarily low-level perpetrators such as Ntaganda and Lubanga. After all, this cost over €250 million to run every year. So it is a success, but then there are certain caveats.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that there are bigger fishes to catch.
Absolutely. I mean, they have not been that successful. The court has not been that successful when it comes to very high-level perpetrators, such as the former president of Kenya and more recently the former president of Cote d'Ivoire, Laurent Gbagbo, who was clearly acquitted on appeal. So those are the sort of successes that one looks forward to, bearing in mind that this is a court that costs the international community $250 million, €1 billion every year to run.
Mm. And also looking at the fact that Ntaganda also is the first person to ever surrender to the ICC. And according to his lawyers, he himself was a victim as he had been recruited as a child soldier. Are the judges likely to consider these when sentencing him?
Well, that is true. Ntaganda walked into the U.S. Embassy in Kigali in 2013. In that regard, it may also be argued that Ntaganda himself was a victim of the very offense for which he was being prosecuted. As a former childhood soldier himself, who was recruited by more powerful political figures in Eastern Congo. But that said, despite his surrender, you must bear in mind that he did not plead guilty to any of the crimes charged, but rather chose to have a full-blown international trial at The Hague, spanning over 5 to 6 years, at great expense to that court. That in itself is very unlikely to earn him any credit. In addition, of course, prosecutors will argue that Ntaganda will...
Oh, seems we have... Okay. We can hear you, sir. Go ahead.
And in that capacity, he would have, of course, be said to have played a role that was more direct to the commission of these crimes, and which resulted in the killing of over 800 people. So those are very serious allegations. I very much doubt that his surrender will earn him any credit.
Okay, and we also understand that he has 30 days to appeal. What are his chances of having a more favorable outcome if he decides to toe that path?
There is an automatic right of appeal, and he may choose to exercise his rights in that regard. Regarding his chances of success, well, that remains to be seen. That will very largely depend on the issues raised on appeal by his lawyers, be they questions of law or questions of fact, and what, of course, the appellate judges make of the arguments raised on his behalf.
All right, then, Mr. Charles Adeogun Phillips, it's been interesting getting your thoughts on that issue. Well, we'll have to see how it all plays out. Thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you for having me.
Moving on, Mali's Prime Minister Boubou Cissé has pledged to beef up security in the country's central region that has seen several attacks described as tit-for-tat ethnic clashes. During a 5-day tour of the region, Mr. Cissé says the government will create a bigger security net. He adds that the country's forces will be deployed on the ground and a total of 3,500 men will be put in place. In the past year, dozens of people have been killed as members of the pastoral Fulani community have clashed with the more settled Dogon community. The UN says that some 70,000 people have fled the violence. In North Africa, the Supreme Court in Algeria has ordered the detention of a former head of the FLN political party, which dominated the country's government for decades. The Jamel Ould Abbiz is facing allegations which include squandering public money. He is the latest in a series of senior political and business figures who have been found caught up in corruption inquiries. The investigation into members of the elite began when President Abdulaziz Bouteflika was forced to resign in April after weeks of huge pro-democracy demonstrations. South Africa's public protector, Busisiwe Mukwebana, has released a report on 6 investigations the office have been conducting. Some of the highlights of the investigation are tender irregularities in connection with procurement and awarding of a contract worth 6.31 million rand by the Amathole district. Also, the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, violated the Executive Ethics Code by deliberately misleading the National Assembly and failing to disclose that he had met with a member of the Gupta family. The public prosecutor says President Cyril Ramaphosa has to take disciplinary action against Mr. Gordhan. Mrs. Makwibana pointed out that it has been very difficult concluding the investigations as her office has faced a lot of resistance from people seeking to undermine the integrity of the public protector.
The appropriate remedial action I'm taking, or remedial actions, are the following. The President of the Republic of South Africa to take note of the findings in this report insofar as they relate to the erstwhile Minister of Finance, Mr. Gordhan, and to take appropriate disciplinary action against him for his violation of the Constitution and the Executive Ethics Code within 30 days of issuing this report. The second one, the Speaker of the National Assembly, within 14 working days of receipt of this report, refer Mr. Gordhan's violation to the Code of Ethical Conduct and Disclosure of Members' Interests of Assembly and Permanent Council members to the Joint Committee on Ethics and Members' Interests for consideration in terms of the provisions of paragraph 10 of that of the Parliament Code of Ethics. Minister of State Security, within 90 days of issuing of this report, act in line with the Intelligence Services Amendment Act, implement in totality the Office of the Inspector General's report of intelligence report dated 31 October 2014.
Still ahead on the program. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed presents the 2019-2020 budget to Parliament, announces plan to create 3 million jobs. That's in a moment. Please stay with us.